Hey, everybody. Have you ever heard about any sort of interesting stories about the insanity defense or psychotic breaks from reality? If that type of stuff interests you, this story about postpartum psychosis is for you. I am MysterE. This is MysterE's Mysteries, and we are here today to explore all mysteries involved in the world of psychology. So, the story I'm going to talk to you about today is about a woman named Andrea Yates. Andrea Yates is from Houston, Texas. She ended up, she was a nurse for several years from about 1986 to 1992, just so you know the time frame that we're dealing with. She met a gentleman by the name of Rusty, and his name is actually Rusty Yates, and they were married. And Rusty and Andrea would be considered a little bit more of like an evangelical Christian family. So they were kind of in the belief that, whatever naturally happens with children, that's how many children we're going to have. So they ended up having 4 kids, and this was they bopped like from Houston to Florida and then back to Houston. They're very, very educated people. Like I said, Andrea was an RN nurse, and Rusty worked for NASA as an engineer. They ended up having several kids. I said 4. It ended up being 5. But during the process of having these children, Andrea started to struggle with something called postpartum depression. If you haven't heard what postpartum depression is is a mental health crisis that occurs shortly after a mother gives birth. It typically will hit anywhere between 1 and 3 weeks after birth of the child. And the mother struggles with sadness, anxiety, fatigue, really has a difficult time taking care of herself or taking care of her children. On a side note, there was a controversy in the early 2000s between Tom Cruise and Brooke Shields. So if you ever want to look up any fascinating YouTube stories, Tom Cruise in his ultimate male wisdom didn't believe in postpartum depression, and Brooke Shields had struggled with it. So there was a pretty heated debate between them. So anyway, just a little side note there. But Andrea started to struggle with depression following the birth of each child. Now, one of the things that happens with postpartum depression is it can get worse with the birth of each child. And by the time Andrea had their 4th child, she was struggling not only with postpartum depression, but she had also been then diagnosed with postpartum psychosis. The difference between postpartum depression and postpartum psychosis is this. When somebody suffers from a psychotic break from reality or a psychosis, with this break from reality, they have a difficult time telling what's real from what's unreal. In this particular case, excuse me, Andrea was struggling with this belief system that her children, her boys, because at that time she had 4 boys, were destined to be damned to hell because of her failings. And so she started to experience these psychotic breaks that were telling her to do things that she really shouldn't do, and some of them involved harming her children. Andrea was placed in a mental health facility on at least 2 occasions following the birth of her 4th child. And on those 2 occasions, while she was there, she was diagnosed with postpartum depression that would ultimately lead to postpartum psychosis. And her psychiatrist at the time warned her and Rusty that if they were to have another child, that this postpartum depression slash postpartum psychosis was only going to get worse. The stories are different between what the psychiatrists say and what Rusty says. So if you're interested in learning more about that back and forth, feel free to look it up. I'm not going to get into the hearsay portion of it. I will just say this. Ultimately, after the psychiatrist claimed that she told them you shouldn't have any kids anymore, she had been prescribed this antipsychotic medication called Haldol, and this medication helped to curb some of her psychotic episodes, which included these delusions, which are the incredibly bizarre, disorganized thoughts involving persecution, paranoia, that type of thing. But shortly after she left the hospital, about 7 weeks later, her and Rusty conceived, and they were going to have another baby, and they had another baby 9 months later. And following the birth of that last baby, Andrea Yates' psychosis, postpartum psychosis, became unbelievably horrible. And she had full-fledged psychotic breaks. She could not take care of herself. She could not take care of her children. She was hospitalized. It was not good. Now, without diving too much into insurance on this episode, we'll talk more about that in future episodes. The insurance company that will remain nameless stated in their policy that you could only be placed in a mental health facility insured for 10 days. So after those 10 days, she was removed from the facility. The psychiatrists told Rusty and Andrea that she should not be alone with the children at all. Rusty believed that it was good for her to have a little bit of time alone with the kids because he thought that would help her to start to do a better job of taking care of the kids. But the psychiatrists were worried enough about Andrea's mental state. She thought that both her and the children, the 5 children, were not in a safe place. Rusty decided to leave her alone for 1 hour a day anyway. And so Rusty would leave for work, and for a 1 hour time frame, Andrea would be alone with the children. And after that 1 hour, babysitter, I think it was one of the mothers, the mother or the mother-in-law, but I'm not 100% sure, but a babysitter would come in and help Andrea with all of these things. Not only to take care of the children, but also to make sure that Andrea was in a safe place and the children were in a safe place. What this led to was Andrea waiting for Rusty to leave. And when Rusty left, Andrea filled the bathtub with water, and she ritualistically and systematically drowned all 5 of her children. She laid them out on the bed, on her bed. She called the police. She wouldn't tell them what she did. But she did say that the police needed to come right away. And she also called Rusty and told him that he needed to come home right away as well. During the interrogation of Andrea, she talked about the need to drown her children, her knowledge that what she was doing was wrong, but this intense need to do it because her children were destined to hell, and if she drowned them, she would save their souls. And but she also recognized that she did it during that window, that 1 hour window, because she knew her husband or the babysitter would stop her from doing it. This leads us to the trial. If you remember our talk about the insanity defense, oftentimes, depending on the state, number one, for somebody to be claimed not reasoned by guilty of insanity, number one, they had to know that what they were doing was, know the difference between right or wrong when they were doing something. And number two, that it could not be premeditated. If you just heard this story, you know that Andrea knew what she was doing was wrong, but it didn't matter to her. And number two, she planned it out. So during the trial, they tried the not guilty by reason of insanity defense. It ultimately failed. She was convicted of capital murder. The prosecution was striving for a death penalty, but in various states, you have circumstances that will be taken into account. And the circumstances involving Andrea Yates' mental capacity at the time were taken into account by the jury. So the jury said no to the death penalty, and this was in Texas, which, yeah, that's a little, right? A little strange. Don't mess with Texas. No offense to my Texas people out there, I get it. But they said no to the death penalty. So she was sentenced to 40 years to life, which means she had the chance for parole after 40 years. Within the first few years, it came to play that one of the expert witnesses falsified testimony. It was not on purpose, but it could have influenced the jury. So they got a new trial. There was a new trial, kind of, sort of. Ultimately, the trial lasted only 3 days, and it was pretty much immediately said that she was going to be found not guilty by reason of insanity and sentenced to a mental health facility for the rest of her life, where she is today. There's a lot of ins and outs about the insanity defense, and there's a lot of ins and outs about the difference between having a psychotic break and being deemed not guilty by reason of insanity. This is a case where Andrea Yates suffered from a severe mental illness and that evolved into a psychosis for many, many years. It went semi-treated to untreated, and it led to a horrible, horrible situation. It shows lots of different things about the difficulties postpartum, and it shows some of the intricacies involved with our legal system. And it's just an incredibly interesting story. So if you do want to check out things in a little bit more detail, just look up Andrea Yates and to find out more. It's a very fascinating story. But I hope you learned a lot of really interesting things today. I am MysterE. This is MysterE's Mysteries. And please follow us subscribe to us on Spotify or Apple, any place that you can find podcasts. Check us out on YouTube. You are hitting up those reels so much. It's fantastic. And once again, thank you to our producer and director, Bear Wade, for all of his work. If you are an influencer, if you want to start podcasts, he's the guy to check in with. Hope you all have a terrific day. See ya.